Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's event. I'm Jason Gumpert from MSDynamicsWorld.com. It's time for our next Portals community call for this month, September 2020. As always, we are joined and led by Nick Hayduk of Engineered Code. It's great to have Nick back with us for this month's episode, and we have one planned for next month. So look out for details on that in a little while as we get rolling here. As always, we welcome your questions. Please look for the questions block in the webcast interface if you're here live, and we will take any of those that come in. So without any further delay, I think we're ready to start. Nick, I'm going to hand things off to you.
All right, thank you very much. I think I showed my screen and now it's paused, so I think it should be showing now. If not, please use one of the channels to yell at me. I'm just going to bring up the questions over here.
We're seeing a title slide right now, right?
Yep. Okay. All right. Sorry, I just got a little distracted there. As soon as we hit the start recording, it gave me a warning that I was running low on disk space. So apparently my 450 gig hard drive is, I'm down to less than a gig. So we'll see how that goes. All right. So yes, thanks everyone for joining us today. Let me jump back here. Thanks for joining us on our kind of monthly Portals community call here. The topic that we've got today, the featured topic, is entity permissions. As always, we'll kind of cover some news and Q&A and all that sort of stuff. But quick introduction here. My name is Nicholas Hayduk. I'm the president and software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting, Inc., which is a Microsoft partner based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been working with the Power Apps Portals products essentially since its beginning. I started my career off at ADX Studio, which was the company that built Power Apps Portals, and was acquired by Microsoft about 6 years ago now. If you are interested in connecting with me on these social media platforms, I've got my LinkedIn there, I've got Twitter, blog, I've got my YouTube channel there where we do post kind of weekly tips. I'm also a host of a podcast. I should probably update that link. So if you like podcasts and you want to hear a podcast on Power Apps Portals, we did just release a new episode last week. But yeah, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know if you ever want to chat Portals. Always happy to do that. Thanks to Jason and the entire team at MS Dynamics World for helping us out, getting the word out with these calls, getting us the go-to webinar software, and helping me moderate. So I really appreciate their support in what is this, I think, our ninth month in a row. So it's been a great partnership, and just really happy to have have them aboard on this this journey that we're going on. All right, so again, the agenda for today, we will cover the whatever kind of we've got for Portals news, which isn't a ton this month. We'll then get into today's topic, which is entity permissions. We'll kind of reveal the date and time of the next Portals community call, and we'll hopefully leave some room for some Q&A. So, jumping right in, and yeah, as Jason mentioned, if you do have any questions, just throw those in the questions feature, and I will try and keep an eye on that and get any questions that you might have answered throughout the session here. All right, so in terms of Portals news, I just did want to kind of get the word out again about the virtual Portals conference that's coming up. So I know there was one on the couple weekends ago, which was the Power Apps Portals Saturday event. So I know that was a great event. And we've got another one coming up on October 15th that I'm helping to organize. We've kind of gone through all the sessions that were submitted. So that process is kind of wrapping up. What we've got is a couple of 5-hour blocks of content. So we're kind of splitting it up into two blocks at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Eastern to help all the folks all over the world, get some great Portals content. So look for some kind of more specific announcements on speakers and that sort of thing pretty shortly here. So yeah, mark your calendar, October 15th, or if you happen to be in on the other side of the world, I guess that would end up being the 16th for you folks, kind of in the during the day there. As I mentioned, there is a new episode of the Refresh the Cache podcast. Colin and the other Nick and I, we chatted about the portal's web API, just kind of our experiences with it and kind of where we see that going. So that was the topic that was released, I think, last week. So feel free to check it out and subscribe and do all that sort of stuff that you can do with podcasts. And just as I was kind of going through my Twitter feed, I did see this article from Ulrike about combining portals types. So essentially merging functionality from different portals templates into a single portal. And it's a process that I've been asked about quite a bit, whether it was possible or not. And the answer always is, yeah, it's possible. It's a little bit complicated, but it's really great to see a blog post that someone put out there of kind of what the process is to do that. And kind of at a high level, it is essentially you install multiple portals, and then you take the records associated with the portals and kind of combine them into a single portal. So you do kind of have to install both of them in order to get the correct solutions in there, and then you've got that data, and then you kind of merge them together. But a great article from Ulrike there, and yeah, check it out if you ever wanted to do something like, if you've got the community or the customer self-service portal, but you need blogs or ideas, it is technically possible. A little bit of a process, but that blog post should help clear that up. So great blog post there. All right, that kind of covers the news portion of today. What I wanted to then dive into is our topic, which is entity permissions. So what are entity permissions? That's probably a good place to start. So entity permissions are used to control access to the CDS data for certain aspects of Power Apps Portal. So there are a number of different types of permissions in Power Apps portals, and entity permissions are used to control certain aspects. So entity permissions are what are used to control or to apply permissions to entity forms, entity lists, web forms. Their entity permissions are also enforced if you're doing fetch XML queries in Liquid. Entity permissions are also one of the layers of enforcement of permissions for the web API that is in preview right now. And entity permissions also come into play for enabling entities or custom entities in global search. So if you ever wanted to add your own entity types to the global search, one of the things you have to do is configure the entity permissions appropriately there. So again, entity permissions are all about controlling access to the underlying data that is in our CDS instance that's attached to our portal. And the ones that I've got here on the screen: entity forms, entity lists, web forms, fetch XML and Liquid, portals, web API, and the custom entities in global search. Those are all aspects where the entity permissions functionality is enforced. So what is an entity permission? So each permission essentially provides for a specific entity type the ability to read, write, create, delete, append, and append to. So these are similar permissions to what you'd see in your kind of typical the CDS security model. So you got the read, the write, the create, the delete, the append, and the append to, which every time I get into that, I have to remind myself whether I need the append or the append to permission. But it's essentially kind of similar to that. And again, it's each entity permission record provides the permission to do those on one specific entity type. So you'd set it up for contacts or accounts or activities or whatever is the specific entity type that you want to provide permission to. You need one entity permission record for each one of those types. And then what you do is you create your entity permission record. You then decide which permissions you want to give and how how do we determine which records that people get access to. So that's probably the big question is, so when we create one of these entity permissions, how do we know which records do we get access to? if I say I have the read permission, does that mean I can read every record in CDS of that particular type? And of course, the answer to that is no, depending on how you set it up. Typically in a portal scenario, what you're trying to do is you're trying to kind of show the records that are related to the person who's logged in. That's kind of the most common scenario that we run into. So entity permissions are primarily based on how records are related to the login contact. Whether that is directly related to, so if there's like literally a relationship between contact and the record that you're trying to create permissions for, then that's great. But it can also be indirectly, so it could be multiple relationships away. So a great example that I'll be showing here is if you want to provide the ability for someone to create notes on a portal, notes are generally, they're related to another entity. So if you want the user to be able to read existing notes, you don't want to say, hey, someone can read all notes in the whole system. That's probably too many permissions. You generally only want them to be able to read the notes associated to the records that they have access to. So that would be a case where you're defining, I can read the notes if that note is related to another record that I'm related to. So again, primarily when we're talking about entity permissions, we're talking about how records are related to a particular contact, whether that's directly or indirectly. So it's also important to note that in kind of the common model-driven apps, all the security is based on the ownership of records. So what you'd see is I can read all the records that I'm the owner of, or all the records that are owned by someone in the same business unit as me, or maybe I can read all the records in the organizations. When it comes to portals, those permissions are irrelevant. It has nothing to do with ownership. It's all based on how a record is related to the current contact. And then so for each entity permission, you define the scope, and the scope is what tells the system, okay, which records should I actually have access to? And so there are 5 types of scope. As I mentioned, the main one that you'll probably see used is contact, but there's also account scope, parental scope, self scope, and global scope. And we'll get into those in just a second, and we'll kind of dive into each one of those separately, and I'll kind of explain which each one of those is. The other important thing to understand is that once you create your entity permissions, the way that you assign those to the contacts are via web roles. So web roles are kind of you create the roles, and then the web roles can have any number of different permissions, including entity permissions or web page access control rules or website access permissions. There are a number of different permission types that are available in Power Apps portals. So entity permissions are just one of the things that you can attach to a web role, and a web role can have multiple permissions associated to it, so multiple entity permissions, and then an individual contact can also have multiple web roles. So when you look at all the permissions that a contact may have, including any permissions that they might get from the kind of the special authenticated user's web role, you have to basically it's the most capabilities that any of those roles give them. So if they have one role that says they can read contacts but they can't edit them, and they have another web role that says they can read and edit, they'll get those permissions if they're kind of related in the same way. And we'll talk about that in a bit too, that you can have it so that a contact can only read some contacts but edit other ones, and it's again based on those relationships. But in general, you look at the contacts web roles, whether that's the ones that they're directly related to or the one that they get via the authenticated web roles, and that's what's defining which entity permissions a particular contact has. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into an example here to kind of show you how entity permissions are set up, how they work, how they're how they affect the interface, that sort of thing. So I'm going to jump over to my browser. There we go. Okay. So I think I've done this kind of example once or twice in the past. I happen to enjoy in my spare time heading out to a golf course and swinging some clubs. So that's kind of one of my hobbies away from work. So in this example, what I have is I have a custom entity that I've created called golf courses. And there are records in the database. I can promise you that if we were to do an advanced find, and I'll bring that up here, if we were to do an advanced find, we would see that there are golf course records in the database. So you can see here, I've got 2 records created here in the database. Now, when I go to my page here and I click refresh and load this up, again, we're not going to see any courses loaded, and that's because I haven't done anything to configure entity permissions. And so by default, if you don't set anything up, there are no permissions. So the first thing I could do is if I just wanted to show all golf courses to anyone, there's one thing I could do that's kind of special for entity lists, is I can go into my entity list and I can actually say, I don't actually care about entity permissions on my list. So that is an option. Obviously use that option carefully, but in some cases it is the right decision to say, I don't actually care about entity permissions. Now, for most of the other features that I talked about that use entity permissions, like the fetch XML in Liquid, or the searching, the custom entity search, or the web API, turning off entity permissions is simply not an option. This just happens to be kind of something that's special to entity lists and web forms and that sort of thing. So just be aware of kind of the implications of saying don't enable entity permissions. So if I save that, jump over here, clear my cache, and jump back over to my portal, I should see a couple records pop up here. So there's my records, and again, I haven't set up entity permissions. I've just told the entity list, I don't care about entity permissions, just show me all the ones that are configured for that list. So that's the other thing to understand it, and I'll get into a few more use cases on it in a minute. But when you're using entity lists, it also applies whatever filters are included in the views that you've defined. So this particular view happens to be all active courses. So entity permissions are always applied kind of after the filtering that is included as part of your views. So if you have a view that has some extra filtering on it, all that filtering will get applied plus the filtering that has to do with the entity permissions. So it's always kind of a combination of those two. It doesn't kind of replace the filtering that you have on the view. And if you define a filter on your view, entity permissions are always going to be enforced, assuming, of course, you've checked the entity permissions box. All right, so I'm going to enable entity permissions back here, and we're going to figure out how do I get access, how do I make it so that I can enable entity permissions but be able to view the golf courses that I want. So if I go back here and refresh, I should get back to a state where I have no records. All right, so I have no permissions to view any records. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my portal management app, and I'm going to go into entity permissions. And you'll see that right now I have no entity permissions at all configured for my application. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to say this is a permission for golf courses. Now, with every entity permission, I have to pick which entity is this pertaining to. And I'm going to find golf course. You always have to pick which portal is it related to. In this case, I only have a single portal. Then you pick the scope. So as I mentioned, there are 5 scopes options for entity permissions. The first one is global. If I select global and I click save, what global means is that you have access to every single entity in the system, every single record for the golf courses in the system. So it doesn't matter who it's related to. There's really no conditions other than every record that's in the system you have access to. Now that where you'll typically see that is for more kind of configuration type data. So if you have a lookup that points to provinces or states or countries or products, those types of entities, often that's where you'll see the global scope, because it doesn't really matter who you are. You maybe should see all the products, or you should be able to see all the countries when you're trying to select which country you're in. So that's typically where you would see the global scope, is for more kind of configuration type data. So it's relatively common to see that on a portals implementation, but not very exciting, because it basically shows you everything. And what I'm going to do is, just to kind of prove this point out here, I'm going to click that. I'm going to say I want the read permissions on my golf course. So I'm going to say yes. I'm going to click save. So now I'm going to flip back. I'm going to clear the cache, and I'm going to see if I've got a permission, if I've got permissions to my golf courses. And I know that I won't, because I've forgotten one important step. And a step that I see people forgetting over and over and over again, and that is, even though I've created the permission, I haven't associated it with a web role. A permission by itself is useless because no one is going to get that permission. So what I need to go down here and say, I want to add my existing web roles. Now, if you're not kind of familiar with the out-of-the-box web roles that come with Power Apps portals, there are two special ones, and one of those is the anonymous users. And so obviously someone who's anonymous isn't logged in, they don't have a contact record. So the anonymous users web role is a special web role that anyone who's not logged in gets those permissions. Again, there's no contacts associated with it because no one's logged in, but if you associate any permissions with the anonymous users web role, and so just as an example, what I'll do is I'll go over to this. This is a different tab where I'm not signed in. If I go over to this, again, I have no permissions. So if I assign this to the anonymous users web role, click add. Now I've got anonymous users. If I go and, of course, clear my cache, jump over to my golf courses over here, I should see golf courses now. So now I see golf courses. I'm not signed in, but because I've added the entity permissions to the anonymous users web role, as an anonymous user, I can see that. Okay, now I'm going to refresh this page over here, and we'll see if we get any courses. And we still don't hear because I'm not an anonymous user in this case. I am a logged in user, so I don't get the roles associated with the anonymous user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another web role to this, and I'm going to pick the authenticated web users web role. That is another special web role that only that a contact doesn't need to be, and in fact shouldn't be associated with. So if we were to open up the authenticated users web role and look at the contacts associated with it, that should always be empty. You don't need to associate contacts with it. Anyone who logged in just gets it by default. So now that I've done that, I go back, I clear my cache, refresh this list, and now I'll get to see all of the golf courses. Okay, so we've got some basic permissions set up here. All I've really given myself is the read permissions for all golf courses. Now, that's great. I mean, that could be useful, but more than likely, if you're building a portal, what you really want are people to be interacting with those records. So what would be probably more common would be some permissions that let certain people update those records. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this permission here. So I'm going to say the read permissions on here, but I'm only going to give read permissions to anonymous users. And that's, let's say in this scenario, I want to have anonymous users can see all the golf courses so that they can kind of search a directory of all the golf courses. Let's pretend that that's a use case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the authenticated web role, and I'm going to actually create another entity permission. I'm just going to rename this so we don't get confused. Golf courses, anonymous, save, and then I'm going to say golf courses authenticated. So again, I'm going to pick golf courses here. Starter portal. Now let's quickly look at some of the other scopes. The self scope. The self scope you'll see on a portal. The self scope is it gives you access to a single, not even entity type, but a single record, and that is your own contact record. So often you'll see the self scope created so that a person can update their own contact record. So it's a pretty kind of special case that you'll see it in there, but you're not going to be creating a bunch of new entity permissions with self scope. It's a pretty kind of unique and niche permission. The other three that are the ones that kind of form the foundation of this kind of relational permissions model are account, contact, and parent scope. So what we're going to focus on today is contact and parent. So we're going to start off with contact. And when we create a contact scoped permission, what we're saying is the user who is logged in has access to the records based on some sort of way that they're related to it. So if I go back to my golf courses, you'll see that I have a couple of other columns in here. So I have the name of the person who's the manager, and I also have the name of the person who's the superintendent. So I have a couple relationships between contacts and the golf courses. So what I want to do is I want to create some permissions that say, as the logged in user, I should be able to edit the courses where I'm defined as the manager. So if I go back to my entity permissions, again, I'm picking contact scope. Once I pick contact scope, then you'll see the relationship here, and it'll actually be a drop-down list of all of the relationships between contact and the entity I've defined up here, which is golf course. So you can see here I have manager and superintendent. So now I'm going to click, I want to do it for manager, and for now let's just say read. So now as a someone who's authenticated, I have the ability to read. And sorry, I haven't created the authenticated part, but this entity permission allows me to read any golf course where I am listed as the manager contact. I am then going to add a web role, which I'm going to, in this case, do the authenticated users web role. Click that. Go over here, clear my cache, and I'm going to refresh this. So I should, if I've done things correctly, I should see just a single golf course in this view. Now, what's kind of interesting about this use case is that if I go back to being an anonymous user and refresh here, I still see 2 here. So I kind of set up these kind of this weird permission scheme where as an anonymous user, I can actually see more things than I can as an authenticated user. But that may not be practical, that may not be realistic, but it is something you can certainly do. It's not like there's anything, there's nothing invalid about that. It just is probably unlikely that you'd actually want to do that. But in this particular case, I'm restricting my golf courses as an authenticated user to only the ones where I am the manager. Now, what's probably more realistic is for me to say, I actually only want to give myself write permissions if I'm the manager. So I'm going to give myself a few more permissions. So I'm going to give the write, which is the edit permission. So if I click save on that, go back over here, refresh this thing, what we're going to see is I've already kind of pre-configured this entity list to have an edit form on it. So you can see that this little drop down didn't show up before, and that's because even though I've configured the entity list to say, hey, here's the form I want you to use if you're going to edit it, because I didn't have those edit permissions, that option just simply didn't show up. So now that I've given myself the edit permissions on this record, again, if I flip back to the anonymous, while the anonymous can see more courses, they don't have any edit buttons. They do have these buttons here, and that's to see the details of a course, but you'll see that there's no editable options in here. So as the person logged in and as the manager of that, I can then click edit. And now I've got the ability to edit this form, edit the course. And now you can see that I put that edit in there. And that will also be immediately reflected for the anonymous users as well. So there's my edit. So just by configuring that, using that contact scope, we were able to say all the golf courses where I'm listed as the manager, I am able to edit. Now, jumping back to my entity permissions, the account scope is very similar. And in fact, just because kind of a thought exercise, I do like to kind of point out the fact that the account scope is not strictly necessary. It saves you from creating an entity permission, but without the account scope, we could just do the same thing using the parents. But essentially the account scope is how is a record related to the parent account of the current contact. So if in my model, instead of having golf courses attached to people, I had maybe a managing company, I could say, give me all the golf courses, let me edit all the golf courses where my parent account is associated to that particular golf course. So contact and account are very similar. It's all about how a record's related to the currently logged in person, but in the contact scope, it's the contact itself. And in the account scope, it is always just the parent account of the contact. Now, I mentioned kind of earlier that there's this ability to define the permissions for records that are not necessarily directly related to the contact. And that's where the parent scope comes into play. Now, in our case, if I go over to my golf courses and I click the edit button, what we'll see is that I've added the notes area to here. And in fact, I've actually configured that entity form to allow the users who are logged in to view notes as well as create notes, delete notes, edit notes. All those features have been turned on from the entity form perspective. But what I haven't done is I haven't turned on the entity permissions to allow the user to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my entity permissions and I'm going to create, because a note is just an entity in itself, the schema name is annotation. What I have to do is I need to create entity permissions for the note entity as well. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to call this note. And I'm going to call this, and I'm going to put a note here to pick the entity in the website. And just as a test, I'm going to start off with global permission. So I'm saying I can do whatever I want to any node in the system. So let's say read, create, append. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump back to my authenticated entity permissions because I do have to give append permissions. Again, I always forget which one, whether it's append or append to, so I just click them both because I'm lazy. So now, if I clear my cache, refresh this, and try and edit my my form here, edit my course, you'll see that there's still no notes to display because when it comes to notes and for these related entities, the system kind of doesn't want to just give you global edit permissions on notes. So in this particular case, what we want to do is we want to set not as a, go back to entity permissions, go into my notes, not as a global permission, but instead as a parental permission. So what that means is that I'm no longer directly related to a contact. What I do is I pick the parent permission. So in this case, I want to give access for the person to be able to edit or create notes if they also have the ability to view that particular golf course. So I look at the golf course's authenticated experience, and now I get to pick the relationship. Now, whereas before we were seeing relationships between contact and the entity that we are trying to add permissions to, in this case, we're going to see a drop down of the relationship between the note and the entity that we've described in the golf course, or in this particular, in the parent entity permission. So in this case, it's the relationship between the golf course and the annotation. So again, the logic is essentially, if you have access to this entity, which again, if we go back to that one, it would be the golf courses where my contact is the manager, then I also have access to the notes associated to those particular entities. So if I click save on that, oh, do you know, I probably didn't add the, let me just try this thing, just because what I didn't do is I didn't add web roles here, and that's why it wouldn't show up. Just gonna do this just to show you that I could just kind of add the permissions. But the reason we don't like to do that is obviously now we've just exposed all notes on the entire portal, which is pretty poor form. But I do now have the global notes permissions, but what I would prefer to do again is not make it a global permission, but instead make it parental. So I'm going to pick my golf course authenticated. Microsoft script are having a little issues here, and I pick that relationship. So now when I do that, I'll see this same thing. But now I'm only able to see the notes associated with the records that I have access to. That becomes extremely important if we're doing things using Fetch XML or the web API. We want to make sure that we're only offering the permissions that the user actually needs. Otherwise, we're kind of introducing a security hole. We're opening up the gates to say, okay, if they can edit every single note, someone who's kind of smart could hit the web API and start editing notes that maybe we don't want them touching. So that's why we always kind of want to restrict them as much as we can. So now that I've created those entity permissions, using the parental model, I'm now one relationship away from the contact on the notes associated to the entity or to the golf course, but I can now add notes to the golf to this thing. So I just added this note to the Wascana entry. If I jump back over to here, refresh, if I then open this up, I'll see the note here because I did create that global entity permission for the notes. But in general, you can kind of customize those a little bit differently depending on whether you want someone who's authenticated or not. Now I'm just going to move that over to global for a second. I'm going to remove this web role and then put that back to be parent. Save, kill the cache, go back over here. And the notes there. Good. All right. So what we've kind of demonstrated is that you can do kind of one relationship away from contact, which is our notes, and we've been able to kind of secure the permissions there. But the nice thing about the parental type is that it doesn't have to be just one relationship away. It can be two, it can be three. In theory, there is no kind of limit to the number of levels you can create with those parental relationships. Just because there is, in theory, no limit doesn't mean in practice that that's necessarily a good idea. Every time you add another layer of entity permissions, what you're doing is you're making the queries back to the CDS database more complex. They have to add more filtering to make sure that they're only returning the required records. So as much as possible, you want to keep that permissions model simple. Generally, it shouldn't be more than 3 or 4 levels deep. It can get usually a little bit deeper when you start looking at activities because there's activity parties associated, so there's a few maybe extra levels there. But the more you can keep your security model simple, I know that when we worked with the Microsoft Fast Track team, and I know that they've run into some people are reaching out to them for help and saying my portal's really slow, and they look at it and they've got a permission model that's 15 levels deep. And they look at the underlying fetch XML queries that it generates, and they're just these really complex things on millions of records, and they're just slow performing queries. So as much as possible, keep your permissions models simple, but again, you can nest those permissions model a number of levels down. So it would be very common to see golf courses. You could say if you're keeping tracks of who is playing rounds, and then you could have a couple more layers of parent-child relationships there. You can keep creating parent entity permissions, because when you look at this, the parent entity permission itself could be another entity permission that is a parent entity permission, and you can essentially kind of do that as long as you want. So with that, again, with entity permissions, it's all about how the contacts are associated to those records, whether directly or indirectly. That's how we get those 5 scopes, but really there's global, which means you get access to all the records, self, which is kind of a special case for your own contact record, and then you got contact, account, and parent. And then you can see how the account one is just kind of just kind of helps you get there faster. But even if the account didn't exist, all you would have to then do is you'd have to create the record between the account and the parent, and then one more entity permission between the contact and the account. So it would still be possible to achieve what you need to do even without the account scope if you wanted to. All right, I'm not seeing any questions so far, so I'm assuming that's just because this is all perfectly clear and there's no room for improvement. Excellent. All right, that was kind of what I want to cover specifically in kind of the demo here, I believe. I know I've got a couple extra points that I've got in my presentation that I wanted to bring up. Jump back to that for a second. All right, so again, it's all about how the contact's related. We have the scope, and we need to assign the web roles. That being said, you'll notice that I didn't have to assign web roles to the ones that have a scope of parent, because those kind of flow down from the account or contact ones. So when they fall into that kind of parental scheme, you don't have to associate the ones of parent scope to web roles. All right, there were a couple other notes that I wanted to mention. So for the entity lists, it's important to understand that the entity permissions are applied after the filtering of the configured views. I kind of mentioned that. But you also have to keep in mind that there's really, there can be another level of kind of permissions or filtering that gets applied to the views. And this is one place where I see people often getting confused, because another way that you can restrict records to be on the portal to only see the ones related to your current contact are by adding extra filters to a view. And so maybe I'll just go demonstrate that, because it's a kind of a, I'm not sure how many people know about this, but it's actually quite a nice feature. So if I look at, here's my my view of contacts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create some extra filtering on my contacts, so I can see my active courses as manager. So I'm going to open this up. I just got my name and the description, and I'm going to say filter by status equals active, and then I'm going to say also where the manager equals, and I'm just going to pick one here. I'm not even going to pick myself, just to kind of prove out. So I'm going to pick portal user. So in this particular one, I want all the ones where the status equals active and the manager is the portal user. So if I were to publish this and go back to my advanced find, that should yield me, if I look at that view, I should get 0 results there, because there are no records where the current user, or sorry, where the portal user is the manager. So let me just find that here. My active courses as manager. If I hit results, I'll get no records. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and update my entity list. And I'm going to add another view. So right now I've got the active golf courses. I'm just going to say active golf courses, my active golf courses as manager. So I'm going to say that. That's going to give me a couple different views. And then I'm going to go into my entity permissions. And this anonymous one, I'm also going to give it this permission to authenticated users, so that authenticated users can see everything, and we kind of get out of that weird situation I talked about earlier, where anonymous people can see more than the people who are logged in. So when I do that, now I've got those permissions, clear the cache, close this, I go back to my list. Now this person who's logged in should have the ability to see all of the golf courses. So I've got all my golf courses. Now, if I switch over to my active golf courses as manager, again, when I did the advanced find over here, I got no results. Let's see what I get when I'm logged into the portal. I actually do get a results back, and I get the ones where I am the manager. So you might be asking yourself, well, how does that work? Like I put in the filter some random contact, and now it's showing me the ones that are related to me. And that's one of the features that you do get with Power Apps portals. And so the features essentially, if you define, if there's a relationship in your filters to where you're picking a single contact, it will dynamically replace that contact with your portal user on the fly for that particular request. The same thing goes for accounts. And I believe it also works for websites if you ever need to use it for the website record. But if you go in there and you add something where it's related to a single particular account, it will replace that with your parent account on the fly when you're using that on the portal. So often we see people using this and they think that's the proper way to secure the records on the portal. And if you're just using entity lists, that may work. But if you truly only want people if there should really be no access to those other records, we strongly recommend that you use entity permissions instead, because that's the way that you actually secure those records. This other technique is more about just being able to apply extra filters in a view. And it's used for exactly these types of situations where you say, well, I still think people who are logged in should be able to see all courses because anonymous people can. So why is it fair that anonymous people can see something that authenticated people can't? But I still want the ability to show a view of just their things. So it works very similar to how the current user filter works in a view. It's essentially the equivalent on the portal. So again, two different ways of achieving it. One is kind of more for security purposes, and the other one, this technique of adding filters to your views, is really more about presentation purposes. And so when we think about which records show up when you use one of these views, again, the filters get applied that are included in the view. There's that special case of if you include an account or a contact in your filter, that that gets applied, and then entity permissions get applied on all top of that. So yeah, if I didn't have the entity permissions to see that record, it wouldn't have mattered anyway, regardless of what my filtering is on the view itself. Lastly here, going to jump back to my thing. So I've said, I mentioned here, keep in mind the additional filtering based on including an account or contact in the views filter, which is separate from entity permissions. Last little bit here is all the configuration I've been doing for entity permissions, I've been doing using the portal management model-driven app. What is coming as part of the release wave 2 plan is Microsoft has announced that they're going to be adding an interface for configuring those entity permissions in the Portal Studio. So if you're not familiar with the Portal Studio, that's the interface you get when you go, if I go back over here, if I go to apps, and I look at my Portal app and I click the edit button, that's what's referred to as the Portal Studio. So not the model-driven app, but the portal itself. If I go into here and I click edit, this is the Portal Studio. So there's already a few kind of experiences in here that are different. Now, it may be in here. The other place that I've seen it is where they configure the identity provider. So they might be adding it in here, or the other place might be is if you go into here and you click settings, because I'm in the preview, and if you're not familiar with this, if you go to make.preview.powerops.com, you can see all kind of the new stuff that they're lighting up. And one of those things for Portal specifically are the authentication settings. So I'm not sure if they're going to include the entity permissions in the authentication settings or whether it will be right in Portal Studio. But the idea is that they're going to build an interface that doesn't require you going into the model-driven app to configure these entity permissions. And so it'll make doing things like parent and child entity permissions maybe a little bit more intuitive. All right, so got a question here. How may I show contacts related to the portal user using the entity list and edit them if the portal user needs it? So if the contacts are related to the portal user, that would just be, you can create an entity permission on contacts, and because there's a relationship between contacts and contacts, you use the contact scope, and then the relationship will then give you the list of all the relationships for the contact, and edit them if the portal user needed them. Yeah, so in that case, you could just turn on read or edit write permissions if you needed to. But if you select contact scope and you select contact as the entity that you are, creating the permission for, the list of relationships you'll end up getting will be the ones that are kind of self-referential, so from contacts to contacts. So you should be able to do it that way. Hopefully that answers your question. All right. Okay, our next call will be October 22nd at the same time, so 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 12 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. UTC. I do again want to thank Jason and the folks at MS Dynamics World for helping us out with this. And we've got about 10 minutes here. I'm happy if anyone else has any questions that they want that they've got, whether it's related to entity permissions or anything else related to portals, Power Apps portals, that sort of thing. Happy to answer those questions now if you got them. So go ahead and throw them in the questions area. If not, if you got to run, thanks again for joining us. Thank you for your interest in Power Apps portals, and look forward to hopefully seeing you next month. If for whatever reason you're unable to attend next month, just know that we do post the recordings of all the community calls online for anyone to view. So if you can't make it live, you can always watch them later. So I'll hang out here for a couple minutes in case there are any questions, and if not, everyone have a great day.
All right, thanks a lot, Nick. And thanks to everyone in the audience for your time and attention today. We have been recording today's event. We will end that now, but like Nick said, feel free to stay on and ask questions if you like.